Hey, everybody. I'm Erika Sanzi, the Director of Outreach at Parents Defending Education. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm especially excited about the guest that we have for you today. I've met him twice, once in Nashville and once in Boston. In addition to being just one of the nicest guys ever, he's also extremely knowledgeable about evolutionary biology, biological sex, and has become an expert on gender as well because of the madness that we are now seeing play out in our culture. So, Colin Wright is with us. He is an evolutionary biologist, the founding editor of Reality's Last Stand. I highly recommend you read it. He's also a Manhattan Institute fellow and an advisor for the Society of Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. Colin, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to finally chat with you both.
So first of all, let's get to your background. You're an evolutionary biologist, which sounds really like smart. And also, most people probably don't know exactly what that is. So can you sort of talk to us not only about what that is, right? So what your expertise is, but then also what ended up happening with you in academia?
Yeah. So evolutionary biology, it's sort of a broad field. It's the study of how life changed over time since it began some 3 to 4 billion years ago. And there's tons of different ways you can approach this. You can be a paleobiologist or paleontologist. You can study the fossil record. You can look at population genetics and track how new variants spread through the population. You can be an embryologist and look at how sort of selection acts on embryos that result in different body forms in their adult stages. Now, what I studied was the fitness consequences of behavior. So this is a field called evolutionary behavioral ecology. Since behavior doesn't necessarily fossilize, we basically just make these experiments where we can look at how different behaviors of different individuals or their personalities sort of influence their survival, how many offspring they're putting out, things like that. And I specifically studied this in terms of collective behavior of like social insect and spider societies. So that's what I did. And so my experience in academia for a long time was very good. I was just had my head down doing my academic work, trying to get my PhD, studying my spiders. And it was sort of early on in my career where I noticed some people were making weird claims about the biology of sex, saying things that like there's 5 sexes or sex is a spectrum or a social construct. And one thing that is really important in my field of studying animal behavior is this concept known as anisogamy. And this is the distinction between males and females that is rooted in the size of their gamete or their sex cell. We think of these as sperm and ova. And there's all sorts of downstream consequences for these two different types of reproductive strategies in terms of the parental investment they put in these things, and it has influences the behavior of animals. So everyone who studies behavioral ecology has a really good understanding of what it means to be male and female at a very fundamental level, because it results in some of the biggest, most disparate behavioral differences we see across the animal kingdom. So I noticed people making these weird claims about biological sex, saying that there were 5 or that it's a spectrum or a social construct. Initially, this was something I just thought people were wrong about. There's no harm, no foul. You can be ignorant about what it means to be male or female. And so I'd sort of push back against this notion that there's more than 2 sexes, or that sex is just sort of this weird construct. And instead of being met with what I thought would be just a scientific disagreement of, no, you're incorrect. Here's evidence of why there's 5 sexes. Here's these other gametes beyond sperm and ova. I was instead called terrible names. I was called a transphobic. People even called me a white supremacist, just to throw that on top of things. And so I realized that there was something more than just facts that are buttressing this ideology. And I looked into it, looked under the hood, and realized there's this huge sort of body of literature in the social sciences from queer theory that is basically saying that everything needs to be queered, or that there's no real natural categories in nature. Everything is sort of a spectrum We create these realities just through our discourse, this very anti-scientific stuff. I started writing against that. There was a huge backlash. People just trying to destroy my reputation as a scientist, as a person, etc. Long story short, I felt that they had largely succeeded in destroying my reputation. So I decided to abandon academia, partly because of the cancellation attempt, partly because academia had morphed into something that I no longer wanted to be a part of. I started to become a scientist because I thought this was a place where people could have robust conversations about the reality of biology. And it turned out that that wasn't the case. So I left. I was the managing editor at Quillette, which is an online magazine for a while. I worked for the Foundation for Intolerance and Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism for a while. And then I just sort of sprung out on my own, started my own online publication called Reality's Last Stand. And then I was picked up part-time by the Manhattan Institute to sort of talk about these issues of sex and gender more broadly and try to push back against their spread through society. So that's a major overview of what I did and what I'm doing now.
So, question for you. What probably started in academia, we can mostly, I think, agree with that. We can also sort of agree has absolutely steamrolled its way into K-12 schools. So I guess I have two questions for you. One is, how did that happen? How do you think that this suddenly made its way into K-12 schools in both blue and red states, by the way? And also, could you talk a little bit about the social contagion baked into gender ideology? And actually, first, maybe let's just explain what gender ideology, what we mean when we say that.
Yeah, so gender ideology, a lot of people try to, the activist side try to say that this isn't a real thing, but it really is. It's very real, and I'll sum it up this way. Most people probably understand what a man or a woman is, or a boy or a girl is, as being rooted primarily in your biological sex. Girls are adolescent or child human females. Women are adult human females, men are adult human males, etc. So your sex plays, this defines what you are in terms of whether you're a boy or a girl. What gender ideology says is that your sex has absolutely nothing to do with whether you're a boy, girl, or a man or a woman, but rather it's rooted in your gender identity. So anyone, regardless of their sex, can be a man or a boy or a girl or a woman if they simply identify as that. What are they identifying with? Well, if you look at the definitions of what it means to be transgender in the American Academy of Pediatrics, in the American Psychological Association, etc., they define it as anyone whose identity, behavior, or expression differs from the sex that they were quote unquote assigned at birth. And this idea of identifying as a different gender is viewed differently than sex in this area here. So gender is basically like the social norms and expectations that are placed on individuals based on their sex. So social stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. So according to gender ideology, if you're a little boy and you exhibit very feminine behaviors and you sort of identify with the social roles and expectations that are associated with being female, this makes you literally a girl. And then when you grow up, a woman, for instance. So this is, I view this as sort of a regressive ideology that says, that womanhood must be linked to feminism, and manhood must be linked to being masculine and all the stereotypes that come with it. So that's, in a nutshell, what gender ideology is. I think it's largely made its way into classrooms, basically because after gay marriage was successfully achieved, which I was a staunch proponent of, a lot of these organizations, the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign, organizations that are getting millions, if not billions of dollars in funding, they sort of needed to find a new cause. And so it immediately went to this whole gender ideology thing. And I think a lot of people aren't really aware what they're pushing. So in schools, this is sometimes under their anti-bullying curricula that started out as what I would say was sort of this well-intentioned approach to trying to get kids not to, bully their peers based on the fact that they might be a boy who's very feminine or a girl who's very masculine. But then this is sort of just morphed recently into, rather than saying boys are boys and girls are girls and they can behave any way they want to, now it's, oh, that feminine boy, maybe it's really a girl. Sort of reinforcing these sort of bullying stereotypes, I would say. So I think that's sort of why it's in school so much. It's also hard to push back against it because it has sort of embedded itself within the LGBT sort of narrative. So they've draped their ideology with the rainbow flag, which a lot of people don't want to be seen as being on the opposite side of, and they don't want to be seen as the ones criticizing it because historically they're viewed as having won the debate in terms of gay marriage, and now they're sort of using that clout to silence people into criticizing some of their more extreme new tendencies. So that's sort of what gender ideology is, how it got in schools. There was a third part to your question. What was the last
There
part?
it was, but actually before we get to that, I wanted to jump in with something else. One of the things that I've noticed, and I suspect you've noticed too, is that a lot of gay people are very upset by this. They are very upset that because they think if this ideology had been in schools and in the culture when they were growing up, they feel almost certain that they would have been convinced that they were actually the opposite sex. No, and that they would have taken irreversible action as a young person based on what they were hearing in the culture. Are you seeing that? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a huge thing, and I think there's two main reasons for this. Part of it's because of what I outlined and what gender ideology is and what it tells you about what it means to be a man or a woman or a boy or a girl. So people who are homosexual, they are attracted to members of the same sex. Now, gender ideology claims that that is not, in fact, the case. They think that what it means to be gay is being attracted to the same gender identity. Okay, so this can be any sex who happens to identify the same way. So you could have a straight couple that's a male and a female. One of them identifies as the opposite sex, and all of a sudden you have a gay couple. So this essentially erases what it even means to be LG or B. And a lot of people in this community are becoming very aware of the fact that you have trans women who are biologically male, insisting that lesbians should consider them as part of their dating pool and vice versa. So there's a major pushback on that front. And then, as I said, and you can check with the APA definition, the definition in the CDC of what it means to be transgender. It's considered an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity, expression, or behavior differs from what is typically associated with their sex. And so this is basically anyone who's gender nonconforming, any boys who exhibit, female typical behavior, any girls who exhibit any sort of masculine behavior. This includes tomboys. So gender nonconformity is now considered by definition to be transgender. And we do know that most people who are homosexual, they are by and large much more likely to be gender nonconforming than someone who's going to grow up to be straight. So a lot of these people who are gay, they realize when they were kids and still when they're adults, but when they were kids too, that they were the gender nonconforming kid. They were the boy who liked to put on nail polish. They were the girl who liked to, do the rough and tumble sports and those types of things. And that, in this current climate, they would be, sort of looked at with suspicion, saying, because we don't like to usually talk about children being gay or anything yet, especially when they're very young, because they don't have, a developed sexuality. So now they're viewed as, well, maybe this kid is transgender just because they're exhibiting sort of this sex atypical behavior. And that's, it's a big issue. So they would have been, instead of just allowed to grow up and to be a normal, healthy, happy gay adult, a lot of these kids are now being sort of sent down this pathway of gender affirming their cross-sex identity, which can lead to hormones and surgeries, etc.
Okay, now I do want to go back to my question about social contagion. So, historically, children showed gender dysphoria at a much younger age. It was overwhelmingly boys. The majority would grow up to be gay men. some would end up growing up to be transgender. But now what we're seeing as is this huge increase in adolescent girls virtually out of the blue and in groups beginning to claim that they are boys or that they are gender fluid or whatever. So can you comment on this idea of social contagion, not just what that means, but also why it seems like activists are working so hard to deny what is basically obvious to everybody who knows even a little bit about this?
Yeah, there's a lot of pushback among activists because it suggests that kids could be either pretending or confused about their identities. And a central tenet of gender ideology is that kids know who they are, that your gender identity is this fixed aspect about yourself. I'd say there's two pillars to the whole gender ideology that sort of is used to justify most of their prescriptions. One is that sex is a social construct and is mutable if you just change some of your secondary sex characteristics. And the other one is that everyone has this innate gender identity that can be discovered through, intense introspection about yourself, and and you can never be wrong about your gender identity. So the activists, if it was the case that kids are just sort of seeing this as a fad, this would undermine sort of a lot of the ideological underpinnings of what it means to have a gender identity. I think what we're seeing is a lot of the kids who are just sort of noticing their degree of gender nonconformity. Most boys who are feminine, they understand that they don't quite fit in with the other boys in terms of their preferences and behaviors, and same for girls. And so they're sort of locating themselves on this, quote unquote, gender spectrum of behavior. This is being turned into, your gender identity, where you identify. And if this doesn't match completely with these social stereotypes of strict masculine and feminine roles, then the kids are now convinced that they're trans. So there's the social contagion aspect. This is, it's more prevalent in girls. We know that girls are more likely to engage in sort of these socially transmitted types of behaviors like cutting, even things like suicide, or could be socially contagious. And one thing I don't think, so the activists want to say that this is mostly a result of society being more open to this type of thing. I think that's probably part of it. I mean, it is certainly normalized in society through Jazz Jennings. We see almost everywhere you look, any person coming out as trans is celebrated. And so this is seen as sort of a way where kids who are gender nonconforming, who might be seen as the outcast, can now just sort of have this built-in celebratory community. They're all of a sudden sort of like a star, and they're very popular all of a sudden. This is very enticing to a lot of kids. But one aspect I think we can't overlook too is the sort of definitional expansion of what it means to be transgender. This used to be it used to be termed transsexual, and it was reserved for people who, from a very young age, have a intense hatred and disgust for their biological sex, and it was usually very focused at their genitals. And it started very early, and it was persistent and consistent throughout their adolescence, and it did not desist when they went through puberty. And then those people sometimes took steps, when they were adults, to transition medically to appear as the opposite sex. But given this new definition, this has been changed in large part during the Obama years, that being transgender is now, as I said, an umbrella term for anyone whose identity, behavior, or expression differs from what is typically associated with the sex that, with their sex. And so this is an extraordinarily expansive definition that literally encompasses just your common gender nonconformity. And so even if we put social contagion aside, any child who just reads that definition, or any parent or doctor, would say, oh yeah, well, most women aren't into wearing just gowns everywhere. And no one's a perfect stereotype of masculinity and femininity. It's not just Barbies and Randy Macho Man Savages out there. We're all sort of in this intervening space of how we express ourselves. And so by definition, we're all sort of non-binary because we don't fit these perfect paragons of masculine and feminine stereotypes. And so even just by that definition, taking it at face value, I'm surprised that the number of kids who are identifying as trans isn't 80%, because that's probably closer to the people who don't identify strictly with these, complete stereotypes of masculinity and femininity.
It does seem so regressive. We've seen copies of lessons, and it feels like everything. I'm Gen X, where we grew up hearing that like you could be anything you wanted to be, and I mean, there was tomboys, and then there were the girls that had like a big bow in their hair every day that was a different color, and there was never any discussion that like anyone in this group wasn't a girl. Like it never ever came up. And now we see lesson plans where they're listing typical characteristics of males and females that are wildly insulting, first of all, but also based so largely in stereotypes, and they're teaching them to kids as fact. And then they're saying, and if you don't align with these, like you may have been born in the wrong body, you may not even be a boy or a girl. It's absolutely insane. Okay, I want to get back to this topic of sort of cancellation for a second, because what you bumped into a few years ago, and I forget how many years ago it was now, a lot of parents are in a sort of similar situation, not necessarily that they're being driven out of academia, but that when they feel really uncomfortable with these lessons or what's going on, and they raise questions, concerns, they speak at a public meeting, they find themselves, on the receiving end of such vitriol and slurs, really, and find themselves, demonized. And then in the case of parents that are more on the left, they also find themselves, excommunicated from their friend groups and socially shunned. So I'm asking you almost to just tell the parents, like, what advice do you have for them in terms of like pushing through that and continuing to find the courage to speak out on behalf of children when it comes to this specific topic?
I think this is probably the most difficult question that I'm asked on this, because it's easy for someone just to say, oh, just be really brave and do it, because if you don't, then this is going to take over, and this is how we got here in the first place. Silence is what got us here. It's like, that's all true, sure, but it's impossible to ask people who are in certain situations to just sacrifice their entire livelihood, or potentially sacrifice it, just to take a stand on the fact that their kids are being taught pronouns at their day school. It's there's a lot of academics that I see who've invested the 4 years of undergrad, 5 years in grad school. They did 3 years as a postdoc. Now they're trying to get tenure, and that's that takes 6 years before you go up for that. Some of the people are 20 years into it before they're getting tenure, and you're telling them that, oh, you need to take a stand on this one topic because people are denying that sex is real. And they're saying, well, if I speak publicly about this, then all those 20 years of my expertise is just, I could flush it down the toilet. I was in a situation where I was fortunate. I don't have children. I didn't have anyone who was dependent on me. My parents, I knew that they would have taken me back into their home if I needed to be. I wasn't looking at, I wasn't going to be on the street living in a cardboard box or anything like that if I spoke out. So I was I didn't have a lot of the outward, I guess what I want to say is the consequences probably weren't as dire for me as they could be for a lot of other people. If I had children, if I had a wife and kids who were dependent on my income as a academic scientist in order for us to make rent and put food on the table, I might not have come forward and talked about this. Like, maybe I would have just continued writing anonymously. So everyone's in a different position to be able to, in terms of whether they can speak out against this stuff. I would say, to the degree that it's in your kids' classrooms, try to speak with the teachers, try to speak with the superintendent, try to speak, on a one-on-one level with a lot of these people. Try to join school boards to try to get these things changed if you can. And if you just are not in a situation where you can be a vocal proponent of this, you might not feel like you're doing much about it, but support the people who are able to speak about this stuff. Support the ones who are able to talk. Vote for the people who are getting the job done, because there are people who are who've taken that hit socially, who are talking about this full time, who are trying to make trying to be the voice for the people who can't speak. So do as much as you think you can do, uh, and maybe just a little bit more. But that's all I can say. Everyone's going to be completely different about what they can and can't do, and they have a better assessment of the risks and rewards.
I do think that's a great point, that if you've decided that for whatever reason you just can't put yourself out there, the supporting the people who are putting themselves out there, I think is hugely important
Yeah.
and appreciated.
Yeah, I would include
All right.
places like Parents Defending Education. I mean, any of these organizations who are involved in doing this type of stuff, they could use
Yeah,
your
and
support.
one of the reasons that we are doing it is to help provide cover for parents who need it. They give us information or send us materials, but they almost always ask us to remain anonymous because they don't want to deal with the hassle and the headaches and this is particularly for parents that are more on the left. Those are the ones that especially will say to us, like, this will blow up my life. Um, so anyway, okay. Now I want to move on to a very famous, well, I feel like it became famous, cartoon that you created, um, that I actually felt very much like I felt like I could relate to. Um, and we should also note that Elon Musk, I forget how he came across this cartoon, but he did and he shared it. So like it went like I feel like you put it out and then maybe even a year later, it suddenly reemerged because Elon Musk shared it. And it's about how far left the political spectrum has swung, right? So that in your case, you would have put yourself left of center in 2008, and how it almost feels like you haven't moved, but everybody else on the left sort of has moved so much further away that now you're feeling like, what the hell is going on? Do you want to explain sort of what prompted you to create this graphic that so many people related to, including Bill Maher? I noticed that he mentioned it again recently on
Indeed.
his show. So what made you do
Yeah.
this?
I was really just sort of trying to put down in sort of graphical form the way that I've just felt over the last several years, as being disaffected from the community that I had usually sort of identified with, which is people who are, who are on the political left of things. Um, I know this is a very simplistic cartoon. I don't think it represents every possible way in which the parties have changed over time, which is the main criticism. This isn't a dissertation; it's a political cartoon. So I think it just specifically applies to just, I think, some core values that I had that I used to identify as being squarely on the left, which was why I saw myself as being on the left. I've never identified with like sort of the Democratic Party. I've never been, party first type of thing. I always sort of tried to stand back, survey the political landscape, and see where I most see my values reflected, and that's usually what I would decide to vote. Now, historically, that has always been, the left side of the spectrum. And I used to vote that way mainly because things like free speech, I think, where it was a major value of mine as a scientist, as someone who understands the importance of being able to think and speak freely. Even from a civil rights point of view, this is, the free speech has largely been a left wing value because it's a way for minorities to, speak truth to power. We saw this being staunchly defended by the ACLU and Skokie when they defended, the rights of the KKK to march through a very Jewish town, because they had the right to their free speech. We don't need to support the KKK in order to understand they have the right to free speech. And to me, this was just values that I very strongly identified with. So free speech is one. Then there's the whole, women's rights. I've always been, I don't like the pro-choice, pro-life sort of. I think it's like the false dichotomy, but I think at least up to some point, women should have the right to choose. And then women's rights in general, that has always sort of been a motivating factor for me to vote, on the political left of things. And now we see people on the left; they can't even define what a woman is. A woman is basically now just anyone who adheres to these sexist stereotypes of what femininity is. This is like the Mad Men definition of women, and this is now embraced by the left. So I've rejected that whole thing. And then this idea, I think, on a lot of racial issues too, with I've always been sort of the Martin Luther King, judge people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And with the whole CRT stuff, the identity politics, equity initiatives, we're just now seeing this sort of this focus on just racial identity and racial quotas and that type of thing. And so these are just, I guess, three foundational values that I used to associate with the left. And now when I take a step back, I don't see them reflected there anymore. If anywhere, I see them reflected more on the center right now. So that's what that cartoon is meant to depict. It could probably be drawn in many different ways if we're talking about any other, constellation of issues. I'm not saying that the right hasn't changed at all, but at least with respect to these three core values that I had that used to, make me that I largely identified as being the most important right and left issues. I think the left has sort of really gone insane and has spread out far to the left, dragging the middle of the political spectrum with them. So now that I'm sort of center right, if you will, whatever that means.
Yeah, it makes me think of all of the moms who have identified as progressive forever, who also opposed school closures during COVID, and just coming out against school closures, they found themselves being called white supremacists, racists, all kinds of hideous names. And I think they're thinking like, wait, how did opening schools become, oh, because they also get called right wing and MAGA. And so they're thinking, I've literally been I'm a progressive, like I'm on the left, and now I'm MAGA and right wing because I want schools to open. I had similar charges leveled against me, but it wasn't as surprising because they don't identify as a progressive. Now, I also didn't vote for Trump ever, and I get called MAGA regularly too. So I understand what they went through. But yeah, it does feel like everything's just gone crazy. And I think most
Yeah.
people who don't subscribe to either extreme or aren't really sort of like haven't been sucked into this almost cult-like thinking, I think they all know it's kind of gone crazy. Though a lot of them don't want to say it yet. All right, so I want to be sure that everybody watching knows how they can follow you and your work. We actually have often posted links to your work on our website under our resources for gender ideology. But if they want to follow you online, if they want to subscribe, how can they find you?
So you can follow me first and foremost, I guess, on Twitter. My handle, I see it on the screen here, but it's, if anyone's just listening, it's Swipe Right. So SWIPE, and then my last name, Wright, WRIGHT. I have a Substack, or I guess you could just call it a website or a publication. It's called Reality's Last Stand, and that's at realityslaststand.com. I publish a lot of my own work about, trying to debunk a lot of the pseudoscience about biological sex and expose a lot of aspects of gender ideology. I also publish other people's work. It ranges usually from, scientific looks at things. It can be opinion, sometimes news, but it's usually articles that are, I would call, evergreen, which they can be read now. They can be read, a million years in the future, and they're still going to be true because they're talking about biology largely. So that's a good resource if you want to sort of understand the whole sex and gender debate, what it means to be male and female, how activists are trying to sort of muddy the waters there and act like these things are, social constructs without any material content. So you can go to, I think those two places are probably the best, Twitter and then my Substack.
And then one last quick question. I can't remember. Do you do speaking engagements? I forget if that's a thing
I
that you
do.
do.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
and I'd like to do more. I did a very successful one in Davis, California recently that went well. There were protesters, but they stayed outside, and it was great. There was some amazing Q&A, and I would love to do more talks.
Okay, so if anybody runs an organization or is I don't know exactly what kinds of organizations or places even have you come in, but if anybody is interested in having Colin come speak, I can just tell you, like, you'll never meet somebody nicer. He knows what he's talking about. He's not an ideologue. and you'll learn a lot from him. And I assume that if they they could contact you through your website, I'm guessing.
Yeah, there's a contact page there.
Okay.
You can just email realitieslaststand@gmail.com. And if you go to my realitieslaststand.com, I did my recent talk in Davis is available if you want to sort of
Oh,
get an
cool.
idea of the talk I could give. I can also talk about gender ideology, and I'm willing to craft a special talk for any event that you want, depending on the topic you want me to talk about. So yeah.
That is really awesome to know. Okay, so I think we're pretty much done unless there's something I didn't ask you that you feel like we absolutely need to talk about.
I think we covered a lot. That was good.
All right, cool. So, all right. So with that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in, as always, to what we call PDE TV. And again, thank you, Colin, for joining us. We are really grateful. You shared a ton of information. If anybody has more questions about, again, or if you forgot and didn't listen carefully and you need help reaching Colin or you're looking to connect with his work, feel free to also reach out to us and we can put you in touch with that. And with that, again, thanks for joining us. And we are signing off until next time. Take care, everybody.